All right. Parshas Vayakhel begins with the commandment concerning Shabbos and concerning the Mishkan. We find a number of times in these Parshas and these Sedros that discuss about the construction of the Mishkan, and Azhara, a warning concerning the observance of Shabbos. And the Gemara points out that there is a relationship, a halachic relationship, between the construction of the Mishkan and the prohibitions of Shabbos, the forms of work that are not permitted on the Sabbath day. The 39 malachos, the 39 categories of work that are prohibited on the Sabbath day are deduced from the Mishkan. It's because of the juxtaposition between the Mishkan and Shabbos that we're able to know which forms of work are prohibited on Shabbos and which forms of work are not prohibited on Shabbos. Now, we need to understand, it's obvious that if the forms of work that are not permitted on Shabbos is deduced from the Mishkan, and that the Torah seems to emphasize over and over again about Shabbos in conjunction with the building of the Mishkan, there must be a special connection between Shabbos and the Mishkan. And this is a question that almost all the commentaries discuss, both the earlier commentaries, the later commentaries, and the contemporary commentaries. Now, but there is another question, a similar question, not exactly the same. In other words, the forms of work that are prohibited on Shabbos are deduced from the Mishkan. In other words, those forms of work that were necessary for the construction of the Mishkan, that is what is prohibited to do on Shabbos. But Shabbos was given in Mara. That was shortly after the splitting of the sea, splitting of the sea. The Mishkan was much later. There seems to be a dispute between the commentaries as to when the mitzvah of the Mishkan was given, but it was certainly given later. Some say the mitzvah of requiring the building of the Mishkan was given after the Egel Hazav, after the incident with the golden calf, after Moshe Rabbeinu went up to plead with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after Moshe Rabbeinu, some say even after Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the second luchos, with the second sets of tablets. So it seems strange, although it's not that on one hand, we should deduce the laws of Shabbos from the Mishkan, and yet the mitzvah of the Mishkan was not given till much later. As a matter of fact, according to many commentaries, it seems that if the Jewish people hadn't built a golden calf, there would not have been a requirement for the Mishkan. But a mitzvah of Shabbos, there certainly would have been in any case. So we have to understand how is it that Shabbos is dependent upon the Mishkan when it's possible that there wouldn't have even been a mitzvah of having the Mishkan at that time. Now, it's very interesting. So there are a number of answers we could suggest. One answer we could suggest, of course, listen, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what's going to be in the future, and he knew that ultimately the Jewish people would build a golden calf. So consequently, it was with that knowledge, and God knows everything. So it was with that knowledge that he prohibited labor on Shabbos based on the way the Jewish people would be required to build the Mishkan. But we could suggest there are four possible approaches. I'm just going to mention three because the fourth is a very involved approach. A second approach we could suggest is that it was actually Shabbos. It is the forms of work that are prohibited on Shabbos that was necessary for the construction of the Mishkan. But of course, we deduce, we are looking, in other words, it was given over to the Jewish people in Morah what forms of work are prohibited. And later on, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when God instructed the Jewish people to make a Mishkan, in order to identify the Mishkan with Shabbos, he said those things that were prohibited on Shabbos, those forms, those category of malachos, of work that are prohibited on Shabbos, that was what was necessary for the construction of the Mishkan. But we have to understand what was the message that HaKadosh Baruch Hu necessitated in telling us how to build the Mishkan, that it should be done in a manner that necessitated the forms of work that are prohibited on Shabbos. Now, it's very interesting. Now, one of the malachos is hotzah, carrying in a public domain, or carrying from a public domain to a private domain, from a private domain to a public domain, or carrying 4 amos, 4 cubits in a public domain is prohibited on Shabbos. But the question is, what is necessary to define a certain area as a public domain? The Rambam Shita, the opinion of the Rambam, very interestingly, the Rambam says that the desert is an area that people do not traverse too often. And when people traverse it, I'm not talking at the time the Jewish people were leaving Egypt. The Gemara actually discusses that. But under normal circumstances, almost no one travels in the desert. The desert is a deserted area. Nevertheless, the Rambam says it's a public domain. Why? Because everybody has accessibility to the desert. It doesn't belong to anybody, and everybody has a right to walk there. So according to the Rambam Shita opinion, a desert is a public domain. The opinion of the Ramban seems to be that it has to be an area that's used by the multitudes. However, Rashi's opinion is that in order to be a public domain, you need 600,000 people traversing that area. And Rashi, the Ramah says that it has to be 600,000 people traversing that area on a regular basis every day. I'm sure if there's one day that there isn't, that won't take it away from it being a Rosh Hashanah. But under normal circumstances, daily, 600,000 people traverse that area. There are achronim that make even greater requirements. And it happens to be historically, that is a very difficult shita, a very difficult opinion, because the Gemara mentions all kinds of cities that were Rosh Hashanah. And in ancient times, you only had 2 or 3 cities that had 600,000 possibly traversing every day. Rome and perhaps Alexandria. So historically and archaeologically, there is some difficulty in that opinion, but that is the opinion of the Ramah. And so according to Ramah, you need 600,000. Why 600,000 people? Because the Torah, when it counted the Jews, it counted approximately 600,000 that were traversing the Midbar, traversing the desert, that left Egypt. It was 600,000 Jews. Of course, we all know that that's the Jews that were 20 years old and above. That was only the males. And of course, that's brought down by the poskim and the Rishonim that when we talk about 600,000 being a requirement, a prerequisite for an area being considered a public domain, it doesn't make a difference, Jew or non-Jew, man or woman, 15 years old, 20 years old, 10 years old, 5 years old. None of these differences apply. But the question is, there were about 3 million Jews, with including the Arab Rav, who left Egypt, and perhaps even more. So if we are to deduce, now where does Rashi get his opinion? Rashi's opinion, as I mentioned, is that since the laws of Shabbos are based upon what was done at the time of the construction of the Mishkan, and at the time of the construction of the Mishkan, there were 600,000 Jews, according to the accounting given in the Torah. So in order to be considered a public domain, you need 600,000 Jews. It's interesting, Rashi Shita, this is just a side note, is that to be a kibush rabbin, that in order to be a land conquered by the Jewish people as a nation and not by an individual, it has to be through an army of 600,000 people as well. Because when the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael, entered the land of Israel, there were 600,000. Again, these are males and these are above the age of 20. But the question is, if we're to deduce it from the Mishkan, if it's based on the Mishkan, what transpired during the building of the Mishkan, so there should be a requirement of many more, of perhaps 3 million, in order for it to be considered a Rosh Hashanah. And we know all the poskim suggest that the number is 600,000 because that's the number mentioned in the Torah. So how are we to understand the Shita, the opinion of the Ramah? So I think when we say, a person can raise a question, when we say that we learn the laws of the forms of work that are prohibited on Shabbos, from the way work was done in the construction of the Mishkan, in the construction of the tabernacle. So does that mean it's because these forms of work were used in the construction of the Mishkan that these forms of work are prohibited on Shabbos? Or no? This is just the way the Torah reveals to us what forms of work are prohibited. But the reason for the forms of work being prohibited is not because of the Mishkan. And we have suggested such a possibility already. Now, but in any case, whether it's the Mishkan is a form of revelation of what forms of work are prohibited on Shabbos, or the Mishkan is the reason why particular forms of work are prohibited on Shabbos, there must be a connection between the Mishkan and Shabbos. Now, just getting back to the Ramah, in other words, if we say that the Mishkan is only a form of revelation, it reveals to us what forms of work are prohibited. So we can say the fact that there were more people at that time was irrelevant, because it's based on what was revealed. Where it was revealed in the Torah Shebechsav, a number of people, that is to be used in knowing what form of work is prohibited. Now, in the past, perhaps I've mentioned this more than any other thought. I've discussed the Shira Das Yashir. And the Das Yashir concludes with the prophetic statement that ultimately the Jewish people will come into Eretz Yisrael and they will build a Beis HaMikdash. So, and this is more or less the concluding verses of the Das Yashir, of the song of thanks that the Jewish people sang when they, after Kriyas Yamsuf, after the splitting of the sea. And the question is, we see there must be a certain connection between the Shira, Das Yashir, the splitting of the sea, and the Beis HaMikdash. And the question is, what is that connection? Now, I've mentioned all the time about the three Sfarim, the three books that were written by Shlomo HaMelech. Shir HaShirim, Keheles, and Mishlei. In Keheles, which Shlomo HaMelech wrote in his elderly years, he refers to himself as Keheles ben David, Keheles, the son of David. In Mishlei, which he wrote in his middle age, he refers to himself as Mishlei ben David, Mishlei, the son of David. But in Shir HaShirim, which he wrote in his youth, which is a figurative expression of the love relationship that exists between God and the Jewish people, between Shlomo HaMelech and God. So there he refers to himself, Shir Hashirim Asher LeShlomo, the song of songs of Shlomo. It doesn't say Ben David. And Rashi already asked the question, why is it that in Shir Hashirim he does not refer to himself as the son of David? And I mentioned that Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our ancestor, the third of the patriarchs of the Jewish people, the one who is labeled as the Bechir HaAvos, the chosen one of the patriarchs, the father of the Shvatim, the father of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people. So when God appeared to him in the dream at Vayakhel, and he told him, we'll watch over him and take care of him. So he said, if God will be with me, Ushmarani b'derech asher anochi holech, and he'll watch over me on this road that I'm going. V'nasan li lechem lechol, give me bread to eat, to beged lubosh, and clothes to wear. V'shavti b'shalom beis avi, and I'll return in peace to my father's house. V'hayashem li le'elokim, God will be a God for me. And all the commentaries are baffled. Is Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our ancestor, making a deal with God? God, you be good to me. I'll recognize you as God. Chas v'shalom, that such a thing should even be Ola al Hadas. So how is it? What he says, V'hayashem li, then will be a God for me. But I mentioned that we have a double relationship with God. We say, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu, God is our God, the God of our ancestors. We say, Zekeli vanveyu, this is my God. Vanveyu, Targum Ukla says, and I'll build for him a mikdash. Elokei Avi v'Aromemenu, the God of my fathers, and I shall serve him. So we have a relationship with God based on the perception of God in the life of our ancestors. We have a personal relationship with God based on the perception of God in our own lives. And Yaakov Avinu was saying that so long as I was in the tent of my father Yitzchak, so spiritually, Yitzchak dominated the scene. It was primarily Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak. And that's the way God appeared to him. Elokei Avicha Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak. But now that I am being forced to leave my father's house, I'm going to use this opportunity to strengthen my personal relationship with God. For Hayashem li le'elokim, it will not be just the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, but there'll be a personal relationship. And Kehelis and Mishlei, they talk about topics that have to do with the relationship between father and son, and teacher and student. They talk about fear of God. Fear of God is something that's given over from father to son. They talk about tochacha musar, chastising, ethics. That's also given over from father to son. Avos is the ethics of our fathers. B'sefes Avos. So there, Shlomo HaMelech identifies himself as Ben David. But Shir Hashirim is the love relationship between the Jewish people and God, the love relationship between Shlomo and God. So there, it's a personal relationship Ben David is not mentioned there. That's Shlomo and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the Jewish people and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not talking about something handed over from generation to generation. Now, why is it that the Jewish people only sang Shira at that point? Because what was the Shira? The Shira, as I mentioned many times, that was a love song. It expresses the love that the Jewish people had for God. But a true love relationship has to have moments of privacy. You can't have a true love relationship that's always public. It's only after the Jewish people separated themselves completely from Egypt that they were able to sing a love song to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even when they left Egypt, at the very beginning of their leaving Egypt, Vayhi b'shalach Paro sa'am. Paro goes and accompanies them along the way, partially. And we see from Midrashim that there were others, Egyptians, that somehow went along to give reports to Paro. There wasn't that sense of privacy of the Jewish people and just God. They first had to be Guy Mikarev Guy, separated completely. In Egypt, they saw 10 makos, but they weren't separated from the Egyptians. And mentally, it could be that they only were separated from the Egyptians after they saw their taskmaster drowned in the sea, because mentally they were constantly following them. So a love relationship requires a certain degree of privacy. And a love relationship also requires recognition of the things that people normally take for granted. That's what Yaakov said. If God will be with me, and when I'll establish my personal relationship, I won't need special miracles. But even when the things that people take for granted, I'll be able to establish my personal relationship with God. The lechem lechol, the beg a little boast, the shafti b'shalom beis avi, all the things that are just normally part of life. That also has to be part of an ongoing love relationship. Temporary love relationships, non-lasting love relationships, that could be with dramatic things. But perpetual love relationships, continuous love relationships, that has to come with recognition of the things that are normally taken for granted. So that's what Yaakov said. My personal relationship, my love relationship with God will not be dependent on just the dramatic things, on the Kriyas Yamsuvs, but it'll be from the day-to-day things that people normally take for granted. And it's very interesting that after the Mishkan, the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah was done in public. And the Medrash says that why is it that this first luchos were broken, the second luchos were not broken? The first luchos were given with kolos ubroken. Second luchos was given in quiet. First luchos were given, was a dramatic event. Its effect was temporary. And the ultimate quietness, that was the Mishkan. But the Mishkan was not just quietness, it was privacy. The Medrash Rabbi at the beginning of Vayikra, God says about the Mishkan, Lo matzasi yofem min atzmius. I did not find anything better or more beautiful than privacy, because privacy is a prerequisite for a love relationship. And the Mishkan, what was the idea behind the Mishkan? The idea behind the Mishkan, to a certain degree, in Maisa Bereshis, God, people have difficulty in seeing God in the world. Shabbos is the day the Balei Kabbalah and those in Chassidus emphasize Vayinofash. And Shabbos, God became the soul of the world. Now, every person has a soul, but the soul is constantly there. Soul, with the exception of the Rambam, the soul represents the godliness, the connection that a person has to God, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's always there. People, because it's always there, people aren't so sensitive to its presence. And the truth of the matter is, the first 6 days of creation, every day there was something different. There wasn't the law of causation. There wasn't the laws of nature yet. So in theory, would have been a person had, there weren't any people around, but had there been people around, or looking back, it would be easy to see the hand of God because of the differences that were taking place. God, at that point, was not part of nature, but God was creating the things that would later become part of nature. But once we have Shabbos Menucha, what is Menucha? Menucha is the laws of causation, my father would say. Menucha is the laws of nature. The world runs on the way it regularly goes, only because God allows it and gives it the ability to run, to continue. But there are no dramatic differences in the laws of nature. Of course, we have storms on some days, and we have good weather on other days. But all that is part of the laws of causation. All that is part of nature. But the first 6 days, it was construction, if I could use that word. It was building. It wasn't the world going on its regular course. And when the world goes on its regular course, empowered by God, when God becomes the soul of the world, it becomes difficult for man to recognize God. And when the Jewish people had Moshe Rabbeinu, so through Moshe, they saw God. They recognized God's presence. When Moshe disappeared from the scene, it became obvious that the Jewish people had difficulty day after day, nature remaining the same. Even though God is the soul of nature, to recognize God. And that necessitated the building of the Mishkan. And different parts, the Medrash Rabbin, Bamidbar, Medrash Hagadol, different parts of the Mishkan represented the different aspects of nature. Each day, the Medrash lists each day how it corresponds with different parts of the Mishkan. The curtains of the Mishkan that represented the skies. The gold, according to some Medrashim, represented the sun. The silver represented the moon. When it says Yehi Rakia Mavdil Bein Mayim Lamayim, that was represented in the Mishkan by the Parochas. There were different aspects of the Mishkan that represented of nature. The idea of the Mishkan was, in a sense, to go into a place that we can recognize God not just in the Mishkan, but by going into the Mishkan, by having the Mishkan. It will impress upon us about God in nature itself. So that was the purpose of the Mishkan, was to have a place for God, but more than that, for man to be able to come there, to recognize God not just in the Mishkan, but to recognize God in nature. Now, it's very interesting that, but the Mishkan, part of the reason the Mishkan represented the privacy that the Jewish people had with God. Now, it's interesting, we're told by Chazal that you want to come to recognize God, even to love God, you have to focus on two things. Histakel b'taraso and histakel b'olamo. Look at the world. Now, the truth of the matter is, when one looks at the world and he sees how nature interacts, the different parts of nature interact with each other. So one can, if they want, to see God. The proofs of Aristotle, which the Rambam mentions in Moreh Nevuchim, are also based on histakel b'olamo. Look at the world and see the hand of God. Of course, we have many scientists that are agnostics, that are atheists, because they don't want to see God. Matter of fact, Chazal tell us that nature is a curtain that hides God. So on one hand, we look at nature and we see God. On the other hand, we look at nature and it's a curtain that hides God. But it's our responsibility, in a sense, to penetrate nature, to study science in such a way that God will be revealed. Now, from the perspective of the study of nature through science, There's no difference between a Jewish science and a non-Jewish science. Science is the same. I mean, I've heard nonsense that I'm not going to repeat. But the science is the same. So the question is, how is it possible that we believe that we have a special relationship with God? After all, you have many scientists who are not Jewish as well. And I think when you look at nature and when you're motivated by the proper ideas, and with your mind, you can penetrate nature, the curtain of nature, and recognize there is a God there who's controlling the world, who's giving me the ability to exist. And it makes no difference between Jew and non-Jew. Avraham Avinu initially, he looked at a building and he said, is it possible that this building exists by itself? And ultimately, obviously, this building, there was someone who built the building. There's light in the building. Someone is keeping the building going. And the way the Medrash puts it, then the Baal Habira stuck his head out, figuratively God, and says, I need Baal Habira. I am the one. In other words, we know there is a God. But the Ani, we don't know. We're missing that from the scientific perspective. We're missing that personal relationship with God. We know there is God. And there's only one God. But we don't have, through science, you cannot develop, through science alone, you cannot develop that personal relationship. But it's interesting that Zohar tells us, and I've mentioned it many times, that God, when he created the world, is stakel b'toraso ubara olamo. He looked at his Torah and created the world. In other words, to a certain degree, and of course we are limited in our understanding of this, that the world, the Torah was the blueprint of the world. And to a certain degree, if we use the Torah that was given to us, Torah tzivalanu Moshe marasha kehilas Yaakov. If we use the Torah that was given to us, so to a certain degree, we could be mentally on the other side of the curtain. Not just to recognize that there is someone else on the other side of the curtain, but to a certain degree, we can be together with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because we have the blueprint of the world, and there God's involvement is very much apparent, not apparent. Everything is God's involvement. So mentally, we not only are aware of God being present there, to a certain degree, we are there with him. So this is the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we create through creation, but it has to be creation. We recognize God, we can study the world, but establishing that special relationship with God in our looking to the world, it has to be because we were given over the blueprint of the world. which God used in creating the world. So to a certain degree, even when it comes to creation, so when I talk about creation, I'm not talking just about the first 6 days. On the contrary, I'm talking more so about the seventh day onward. So when it comes to creation, where God becomes the soul of the world, Vayinofash. So we are able to establish a personal relationship. And to a large degree, that relationship is not accessible to those who don't have the Masorah, to those who do not have the tradition and the spiritual heritage that was given over from Sinai. So the private relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world is something that to a large degree, according to our tradition, is unique between God and the Jewish people. And it's very interesting. The Medrash says that a non-Jew is not allowed to observe Shabbos. All right, there's a discussion what that means, but the Medrash Rabbi in Bereshis says, why is a non-Jew not allowed to observe Shabbos? To imitate the way of the Jewish people, especially in view of the Rambam's opinion, both in Hilchos Malachim and the Rambam in his Chuvas, that views favorably a non-Jew who wants to observe the mitzvos because they are written in the Torah. So the Medrash says it's like a king who has a private room with his wife, and someone is constantly coming in and interrupting them in their personal relationship. Shabbos represents that personal relationship. On one hand, Shabbos is something that all of mankind could identify with. Brias Olam, creation of the world. On the other hand, Goyshe Shabbos, a non-Jew is not allowed to observe Shabbos in the same manner as the Jewish people observe it, because Shabbos represents our personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's based on recognizing the fact that the Torah was the blueprint for the creation of the world, and more than the blueprint for the creation of the world, the continuous ongoing of the world. Now, and this also is the reason for the Mishkan. The Mishkan represents, as I mentioned, the Mishkan represents the private relationship between God and the Jewish people. Lo matzasi yafem min hatznius, this is the private relationship. So this is the connection. This is the connection between God, between the Mishkan and Shabbos, because the Mishkan and Shabbos are not just mitzvos. It's not just opportunities to fulfill commandments, but it represents personal relationships, in a sense, being separated, to be alone with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It represents the special love relationship that God has with the Jewish people. And it's because of this the halacha wanted to identify Shabbos with the Mishkan, or more so the Mishkan with Shabbos. The Mishkan, that was the soul. That's when God became the soul of the world. Shabbos was when God became the soul of the world. The Mishkan is to help us understand and to recognize God as the soul of the world. So to identify the Mishkan and Shabbos, the halachas of Shabbos and the halachas of the Mishkan are based one on the other. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. No questions yet. If anyone has any questions. Thank you. Okay, so no questions. So feel good and hope to see everyone next week.
Yeah.
And again, the shiur, besides being available on YouTube, are also now on audio only on yutorah.org.